I hope so. I want them to know that they've always got a safe place, and that's not true. Again, that is a privilege. My kids are very privileged in a lot of ways. A lot of the privileges that we had, they're also experiencing, and I think we're trying to make them a little more aware of it than my parents tried to make us aware of it. But it is absolutely something that we're trying to instill in them, that they have a safe place to come back to.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And in this episode, we're going to talk with my friend David. David acknowledges that he was born into a life of privilege. But what's also something he acknowledges is that he had to do something with that. How do you take advantage when you've been given advantages? How can you deepen your education? How can you broaden your experiences so then you in turn can pass on those privileges to your own children? It's a very interesting story. He's got a great lesson to teach us. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. Well, all right, David Nothman, welcome in.
I am happy to be here.
That is fantastic. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I am a father first, a husband, a brother, and until very recently, a privilege of being a son to some great parents, and I'm hoping we'll talk a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. And I've had a great run here in the agriculture and food industry, so I tend to say I'm an ag and food apasionado. That's just because I love getting that music piece in there. Yeah.
That is fantastic. So I love what you said, right? You're a father and a husband first as identification. It's interesting because, as men, you have the rare privilege to be fathers. And then also as husband is that support vehicle. When you became a father, do you think that instantly became the primary identity that you thought of yourself?
I don't think it was instantaneous. I think that it quickly became it, but it wasn't instantaneous. I think we were surprised or unexpected first child. Great surprise, and we've had that conversation with our son. But I think I didn't know what to expect. It wasn't something that I'd planned and so no, I don't think it was instantaneous, but it was pretty quick.
Right. It hits you early. Now you just because I want to mention what you just said, you said until recently a son, did something happen? Are your folks okay? Are they around or did something happen?
No, my mom passed away from ovarian cancer in 2019, and then my father passed away just over a year ago. And so, yeah. So, and I do want to talk about my parents, because they, as a unit, were such great role models for me and my brothers, and certainly what's one of the things that I want to model for our kids.
So, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's
right
where
on.
I know you.
Right on. So you grew up in Pittsburgh. That's kind of where you were born and then raised until you left.
I think I was born. Well, I know I was born somewhere else. We moved there when I was 3, so all of my my memorable life was in Pittsburgh as growing up. Yeah.
And so I'm sorry about your parents and sorry for your loss. and condolences to you and your family on that, especially having it, your mom and your dad pass in relative short, succession. But now that they have been passed, your father for a year, your mom, 5 years, are you looking back at that childhood and their relationship differently?
I think we always knew. I have two brothers, two older brothers. I'm the youngest of three, and I think that we, for a long time, have known how privileged we are in a lot of different ways. But certainly to have parents who were so connected, they really served as great role models for us. And as we think back, we just actually had the celebration of life. We waited a while because we wanted more of the people to be available and plan it. And it was a great celebration of life for my dad. Uh, and my brothers and I, we all spoke. There were some common lines. We actually came up with some different stories, which is always fun. Not using the same story, but I think we knew we were privileged. We were very privileged growing up. We were in a high income household. My father was a physician. My mother, although she was well on her way to a PhD when she stopped, was a stay at home mom. That's a privilege, in my opinion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We and just had a ton of support from our parents in whatever we did, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those stories. But I think we celebrated that recently, but I'm not sure it changed with the passing.
Sure. It's interesting that, you look back at a privilege, and when you were growing up, did you think you knew that you were privileged? Was that something that sunk in, or because, it's so easy, I think for kids to take for granted what they have because it's all they know.
I don't know as if I knew how privileged we were. In fact, I'm sure I didn't know how privileged we were. I think that we knew we were well off, but I don't know. I think the privilege awareness came much later in life.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And then I guess a question I have I just chatted with someone yesterday about this, where there's I don't know if there's a relationship between privilege and responsibility, right? If the more privilege you have, maybe the more responsible you are to uphold that privilege for the next generation of your own family, or to serve others in a greater capacity. Did you feel growing up, though, that your father was a successful physician? You went to a very good school. Did you feel like you had to then live up to that expectation of carrying that forward?
My parents were good about wanting us to lead our lives the way we wanted them, and I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. But they didn't say, "Oh, you've got to do this or that." I think they really wanted us to be good people first and value that, and that was one of the things that they instilled in us. But when I graduated college, I was in a band, and I wanted to see if I could make a go of that. And I remember my oldest brother, who kind of in high school was a bit of a rebel, one could say, a fuck up. And he paid for that in Purgatory in Kansas for his master's program. But I remember I said I wanted to go and try this music thing and be in a band. And I remember my brother called my parents and said, "You're going to let him do this?" And they were like, "Yeah, it's his life if that's what he wants to do."
That's
And
hilarious.
I heard that story later, right? But that's how they were. They were like, "Look, if that's what you really want to do, go do it." I was working, a job at a recording studio and making the meeting the bills and whatnot, but that's what I wanted to do. So I quickly figured out that that's a hard way to make a living, and wasn't the path for me, but I did give it a go.
And good for your parents for letting you be you. I think that one of the and that also in and of itself is a privilege, right? The mindset or a family culture of trusting your kids to figure themselves out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I tried to do that with our kids. Our older boy is a senior in high school and trying to figure out what they want to do. And really doesn't know, and that's okay. And I keep saying it's all right. I certainly didn't know what I wanted to do. I've taken a very strange path in my career, and it's really about trying something and learning from it. And if it's not what you want to do, then trying something else.
Sure. I also think too, though, that as you growing up, and it seems like you're passing this family culture onto your own kids, is that there's a trust in the youngster to figure it out. But I also think that gives that young person confidence that they can figure it out, that they will figure it out, even if they feel lost in a certain moment.
I hope so. I want them to know that they've always got a safe place, and that's not true. Again, that is a privilege. My kids are
Mm-hmm.
very privileged in a lot of ways. A lot of the privileges that we had, they're also experiencing, and I think we're trying to make them a little more aware of it than my parents tried to make us aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is absolutely something that we're trying to instill in them, is that they have a safe place to come back to.
Yeah, I think that actually provides a lot of security. If young people know that there's a safety net, that they are then free to explore, I guess, and more importantly, free to risk, and
Yeah,
they're free to fail, right? And learning that failure is not the end of the world, but failure can, everyone says quote unquote fail forward, but not everybody has the opportunity to do that, but an experience of failure lets you know the things that you might want to do instead. It also creates, I have to believe, just learning opportunities for you as you go through life.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And so as you started to go out, you tried music and just kind of did that experimentation and realized that you want to maybe to do it for love and not for livelihood. As you started to explore that, what were you most interested in, and how did you pursue those interests?
Within music, I was lucky, also maybe privileged. I came to a group while studying abroad in Germany.
Hmm.
We all had a love for music, and we started playing together. And we played almost entirely original music. Obviously, when you first start, you're playing a couple covers, and
Sure.
the first gigs that we had, we played covers, but we all wanted to write our own music. And I would say one of the common themes that I've realized throughout my life is I feel like I do better when I'm in a group. Like I think it raises my bar. I'm not
Hmm.
so much a solo artist or a sole contributor as much as I like being part of a team. And within that group, we wrote some, I think, great songs. I think ultimately we wrote 20 some songs. We
Wow.
recorded a mini album, whatever you an EP. Um, we had to make the decision of whether we wanted to put it. This is going to date me so much, but whether we wanted to put it on a cassette or a
Yes.
CD.
Yes.
And we chose the cassette, and now I got like three of these old cassettes, and I got no place to play it. Right?
That's awesome.
Because more people back then had cassettes in their cars, which is where people
Sure.
played their music, than they had CD players. So, I loved creating. I loved, one of the guitar player wrote a lot of songs, but wasn't a great lyricist, and so I wrote most of the lyrics. I wrote a
Mm-hmm.
couple songs, and of course they contributed. That we had a masterful bass player who was, problematic at times, but man, he was just a very, very good bass player, self-taught.
Hmm.
And we went through a couple drummers, not quite like Spinal Tap, but we definitely went through a couple of them. And ultimately, we got on the radio a little bit, but I think we all sort of simultaneously said this is probably not gonna be our livelihood. So
Right,
yeah.
move up. But what a great experience to have, though. And, not too many people can say that they've tried it and done it. A lot of people say, oh, I wish I would have tried it, but you did. You gave it a go. You realized that you wanted to move on. But interesting, you were studying abroad. It seems, just looking at on your LinkedIn profile, you have a variety of educational experiences, schools that are abroad, an MBA program at New York University. It seems to me, and the impression that even just the LinkedIn profile gives me, is that you're very interested in learning and you're curious about a lot of things. Is that correct? Am I hitting that right?
You are, and I like the personal side of learning. I tend to say always be learning or always be curious, ABC, always be curious. But beyond that, I just loved learning some languages and talking to people in their language. I often encourage, I'm involved in a couple organizations now that develop college students. And when I do interact with those students, I strongly encourage them to live abroad, not just go in
Mm-hmm.
and visit, but to actually live there. It's different, preferably for a year if you can. But
Yeah.
if it's only 5 or 6 months, do that. Do what you can. Do what works for you. I think that first time that I went abroad um, and and lived there, I learned so much about the United States. People ask these questions. It was during the Iraq War or after,
Mm-hmm.
right around then, and people were like, "Well, why did you do this or that?" And tell me about your government structure. I had to relearn all that. The different branches of government. And
Uh-huh.
so I learned a lot about what people were curious about the United States. And I learned a lot in that case about Germany, but I loved it. I loved living I lived in Switzerland for a while, I lived in Belgium for a while. Strongly encouraged my older boy who just came back from Germany to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they're better for it as a result. I think
Sure.
that, yeah.
Well, that's great that you asked them to go out and explore. And I think you mentioned something really interesting about that, where a lot of folks will say, "Oh, I learned so much about myself," which I'm sure you did. But I also heard you say you learned so much about America and how you thought about America. When I had the privilege to travel abroad and study abroad too, and I remember coming back and flying back and flying over the states and saying, "Oh man, this is such a huge country. It's so big." And so you and I live in California. We're about 8-hour drive from where you are in Danville to where I am in San Diego. It's 8 hours to go from London to Edinburgh.
Yeah.
It's 8 hours to go from one country to the next, or three
Yeah.
countries in Europe. It's
Yeah.
it's completely different. The scale of the U.S. is very hard to appreciate unless you're going someplace else. And so, what I found when I came back is my sense of the country I live in changed, right? In terms of a greater appreciation for our regional differences. Whereas, geographically, if you float the US over Europe, it's like you have multiple countries, right? In the same space. You could argue that in America, while we are the same country, we have multiple regions, and the physical distance between California and a place like Georgia or Mississippi is so vast and huge that the experiences that people have living in these different regions is completely different. Could feel like a different country, could feel like a completely separate way of viewing the world. So when you traveled a lot and engage with other folks from different countries, how did it feel to be an American?
Well, I want to pull on the string of coming back with you because
Sure.
that was challenging for me. I know it was challenging for my son more recently. Uh, I was, I didn't go over as, oh, I'm the super proud American, but I do think that I became more humble through that experience about the challenges that we have in the United States. And I don't know if I'd say critical, maybe, but definitely, it's not all perfect here. And definitely saw some things that were exciting and different approaches in Germany primarily, but I got to see a lot of other different countries while I lived there, um, and then later, living in those different countries. So I kind of lost your question there. What?
I think that the idea is you get more humble about it, and you think about America differently. I thought about American culture very differently when I came back, and what's important to Americans in a cliche way versus maybe what would be important to either Italians or French folks or Spaniards, and when you see the difference of behavior, right? So, for example, in France, as you know, as everyone knows, they take an entire month off in August for vacation,
Not
right?
just
And
France, it's a lot of
right, I
Europe.
just
Yeah.
spent a lot. Okay, thank you very much. A lot of Europe. I've got a friend who grew up in Madrid, and they go out. For them, dinner's at 9:30 at night,
Right.
and they
Yep.
go out late, right? And a sense of pace is very different. Um, that's what really struck me, is that a whole way of viewing how to live a life is very different than the United States than it is in other places.
I agree with that. And that's something that I've appreciated about the various places that I've lived. And I would love to live abroad again. Right.
Mm-hmm.
For a variety of reasons that hasn't happened. We had considered it at one point when the kids were young. As they got older, that becomes questionably becomes more difficult. But I just talked with somebody who's abroad with three kids, and she said, the two older kids have loved it. The younger kid wants to go back to the United States, and it's interesting to see how, people vary so much, right, as to
Mm-hmm.
what they want and what they seek out. But those different cultural norms, Spain, as you said, there's so much good in those differences, and that's why I love going and learning. A place that I've never really spent a lot of time is Asia. And
Mm-hmm.
specific, I mean, in Japan, I've never lived there. I've never lived in Asia, and I say Asia, it's a continent, right? It's not a country. But whether you go to Thailand and live there very differently than Japan or Indonesia, or pick your country over there, and it fascinates me. I still feel like there's a lot I could enjoy and learn in Europe and Eastern Europe and other places.
So, you asked earlier about, what it felt like coming back from Europe. And I felt like, Pittsburgh wasn't quite right for me. It felt a little bit small after living in where I studied abroad was in Oxford, not Oxford University, it's the Oxford Polytechnic, the technical school, and there was an arts program there. But through the course of that, I was lucky enough to go to London, and that I could go to, and through there, because it's so close, you go to Paris and Florence and all these great places. And, um, and being in England and being in London and being in Oxford Poly in particular, because it was a polytechnic school, it drew a lot of international students. That was part of its mission, right? So I met people from everywhere. I met people from
Right.
Ethiopia and from Spain and from Eastern Europe. And in fact, really interesting, group of kids at the time, are our age, they were from Erfurt, East Germany,
Germany, yeah,
meaning
yeah,
that
real close.
right. So in Erfurt, what was interesting about that is, for context, this was in the early 90s. So they grew
The
up
wall.
in East Germany while the wall was still up. And she
Yep.
was telling me about her experience where her family said, "Hey, we've got a chance to get out of here. So everybody, you're going to hide under this false trunk in this taxi cab, and we are going to get out of East Germany." And for some reason, like the pickup didn't happen, and she was devastated. She says, "Oh my God, I'm going to live." Here my whole life. This is awful. She said, and then the wall came down, and she couldn't imagine, experiencing that kind of freedom. And we were talking about, growing up in America versus growing up in other places. I could not even fathom what it would be like to not be able to leave where you are,
Yeah.
to have
Yeah.
a wall to block you from where you wanted to go or to explore. Right? I couldn't in no way think about the perspective of the world that way. But she did growing up. And so when I came back to the States and I came back to Pittsburgh, I was like, it's a bit too small for me. And then when I traveled to San Diego, I realized, okay, this is where I want to be. But I think the reason that it's so important, and I was talking about these regional differences in the country, is that, everyone knows that this is a polarized election year. But I also think that it didn't used to be so polarized. I was talking to my daughter, and I felt really badly because, seeing the last several presidential debates have all been shit shows. Every single one of them. They've been a circus for the last 8 years. But I said, you don't remember the debates with Bush or with Reagan or with Carter or with Obama and Romney, they were actually civil. They were actually cogent, thoughtful, complete sentences, meaningful dialogue. And as a country, we've seemed to have lost the ability to have meaningful dialogues. And, you mentioned it about kind of, as men start thinking about how they interact, everyone used to say, and it's a cliche, don't talk about religion and politics. And I thought, well, that's so interesting because, faith journeys are so personal and they reveal so much about who you are and what you believe in and what's important to you. And, who you vote for in America is a very personal, private thing. And it also reflects your hope, aspirations, certain leanings. These are probably the things that help you understand somebody more than who they like in football or what beer they like to drink, right? And the fact that we're so reluctant to have those conversations, to me, I feel a little bit sad about that. And that's one of the reasons, when people say, hey, why'd you start this podcast? I'm like, because we can have good conversations and we have to learn how to have good conversations about things that are important to us and respect other people's perspectives, because everyone has a frame of reference that no one else can understand because they're not in their mind and their body.
They need to be open to listen. And I think that's the challenge that so many people have, is they want to convince somebody else that they're right and you're wrong. And I share your desire that we can have conversations about religion and politics and anything, as long as people say, okay, I may or may not agree with you, but I want to understand your perspective. I want to understand where you're coming from. You mentioned Erfurt, and it's funny, Ilmenau, which is where I was for my Fulbright, is 45 minutes away from Erfurt. I know Erfurt quite well, and I went there. About a year after the wall fell, and I was the first American that many people had ever met in this city, right? And
wow.
It was great for my German because their second language was Russian, right? So everyone's like, oh, I got to talk to them in German. I mean, they want to try, but it was their English was really not good.
When they realized or recognized you were American, what was the reaction?
I mean, they had a lot of questions. But I want to go back to the idea here that this about understanding differences. And you talked about regional differences. Germany's not nearly as big as the United States, but the East Germans and the West Germans were very different.
Yeah.
Right. And there were many East Germans who felt that that the West Germans were very judgmental and said everything we have is better, and that's not the case. There was a pace, there was a connectivity. Obviously, there were things for people in East Germany that they didn't like. I'm not saying it was all roses, but there were some good things in East Germany that some of my friends who grew up there in East Germany, the people I hope you get to meet sometime, that they still endeavor to hold on to, right?
Yeah.
This connectivity with other people. And so I think what was lacking in some cases and was this desire to understand the other party, right? And that was the reunification. Two Germanys coming together, spoke the same language, but were really actually very different. And here we are in the United States, and it couldn't, to use your words, it couldn't be more polarized than it is right now,
and regionalized. It's regionalized. There's a book that I haven't read yet, but my mom recommended it, where someone explores the various regions in America, which is actually strangely very topographically driven, where there's a river or a mountain, right, where these things kind of carve physically these places together, where people stop and they set up camp, and this is where they are. But there are such stark regional differences, and I still think, though, there's the cliche is we have more in common than we do that's different. But what I think we have a hard time accepting is that there are regional differences. there are ways in which people perceive the world. Even growing up in Pittsburgh, right? So Pittsburgh in the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, there's Pittsburgh and there's Philadelphia. But Pittsburgh is 45 minutes south of a small town called Butler. And Butler is a steel town, which was a steel industry town. It's a very different place than Pittsburgh in terms of the perspectives, in terms of the history, in terms of the people who stayed and people who come in and don't come in. And there are regional differences within Pennsylvania. There are regional differences within the country, right? Absolutely. And so I would hope, though, that we can get to a place where we accept the regional differences. We know that they're there, but talk about what's important to us and respect what's important to other people in different places.
Yeah, try to understand it. Try to just be open-minded enough to listen. It's funny because I feel like I'm enough of a chameleon that I could live anywhere for some period of time. It's been pretty clear that if I want to live with my family, we're not going to live in the South, but I would absolutely move to the South.
Sure.
Right? And have that experience. It would be alone for a certain period of time. But I would, because I feel like I would learn something through that experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's wherever I would go.
Yeah, you would learn, and I guess that's part of it too. I love your ABC, always be curious, right? The Ted Lasso, Walt Whitman, be curious, not judgmental. And I have to believe that the more curious we are in a real way, to have more empathy to other folks, I can't help but think the better off we'll be.
I agree. I love that you put Ted Lasso and Walt Whitman in the same group.
We'll be right back. And it's a funny thing because as we start thinking about exploring our own interests, and especially as you get older, and there's so many things that I find that I still don't know that I want to learn. My wife and I were joking that I think now I'm really aware about how much I don't know. I'm like, there's so much I don't know. Right. And then there's this yen for me to figure out, I really want to understand this better. I would like to know more about that, or know more about those people. I want to know more about living those lives. I have a guest actually that I just talked with. We had a conversation yesterday, and he and his wife made a very bold decision to live in France. So he has 5 kids. His youngest child is a 12-year-old. And they decided that they were going to live in the south of France, and she's going to high school there, and he might make it permanent. He doesn't know, but he said it's a dramatic change, and their every day seems to be a new day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I applaud them for that. I think that's fantastic. And that's I know that I had that spirit early on. I think as I became a unit with my wife, she's up for an adventure, absolutely, but more short term than long term. And so I think with the boys in particular, she's a protective mother in that sense, and was very clear in terms of job opportunities. Once the kids got into high school, she's like, they're finishing high school here.
Right. Sure.
And I get it. I get it.
Mm-hmm. Right? So that's interesting that when you just talked about your wife now a couple of times, you used the word unit. I think that's really interesting. And you talked about your mom and your dad. I guess that they had been married their entire lives and lived very long lives together to see their children and to see grandchildren. It seems to me that that's a recurring pattern, at least within your own family, that your family becomes unit and stays unit.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but yes, it's certainly my desire, and I would say that in picking a partner, part of it is street smarts and gut feel, and part of it is luck. I don't know, but I,
I
I,
love it. You're such a romantic, David.
I have I feel like I've been very lucky in my relationship with my wife. We complement each other well.
Hmm.
We talked just a minute ago about learning, and that was something that both of my parents really did throughout their lives. They explored, they traveled, especially after we left. It wasn't something we traveled domestically, but then they traveled internationally. I don't know how many countries they saw after my dad, even maybe before he retired. But up until he was in hospice for like 5 months,
Uh,
and two weeks 2 weeks before he passed, he was listening to this books on tape or video, um, and it was on like physics, like, and I was like,
nice.
you're learning about physics, and the end is near, right? And
Hmm.
and I don't imagine it's going to show up. I'm going to switch my camera around here. It's not going to be good for the podcast, but these are all books on tape that he had that I inherited,
Oh,
and they're too deep.
David,
They're too deep. And
that's incredible.
he was a life learner. And my mom took up painting and Spanish,
Uh
and
huh.
and so I think this idea of constantly challenging ourselves to try new things was, again, a privilege, and something that my wife Jessica, said I could use first names but not last names.
It's all
So
right. You're fine.
they'll find me. They'll find her if they want to. But she took up kung fu during COVID with our older boy, and
Awesome.
the deal was you got to do it for a year, and after a year he's like, I'm glad I did it, but I'm done. She's continued with it, and now it's they started in 2021, I guess. So she's 3.5 years. She goes to tournaments. She just got invited to an international tournament. She always
That's
comes home with a
awesome.
fistful of medals. And this is something 10 years ago. If you'd told her she was going to be good, she would not say she's great. I think she's great. She comes home with a lot of gold for her
Hmm.
level. If you told her she's going to be doing kung fu, she would have been like, nah, forget it. Right. And here
I
she is
love
learning it.
I love that, and that's there's a big it's a cliche to say it, but there's a thing called family values. Like, what are your family values? Like, I support family values. I kind of think, though, that families create their own values, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and in marketing, you call it like on brand, off brand. I'll give you a good example. One day, yeah, and I think you'll appreciate this. Our girls were about 9 and 11, and it's that just on that cusp of elementary school, right? The fourth, fifth, third through fifth grade, and they came. And they're old enough because our daughter at the time was 11. They were old enough to hang at home while we went to go see a movie. And we were like, yes, you're 11, you're 9, we're hitting a movie. We'll see you in a couple hours. You're good, right? We're all good. We're out of here. Woohoo. We came back and they're watching TV, which is fine. And then I looked and they were watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And I said, girls, what are you watching? They're like, oh, we're keeping up with the Kardashians. I was like, how did you hear about that? Oh, one of my friend's sisters was watching it at their house and blah, blah, blah. They were saying about it. So we're watching it. And I went over and I turned off the TV and I said, I'm sorry, this is off brand. We don't watch this in our house. And they were like, what? And I was like, no, this is a family value. We don't watch this in our house. And they got a little bit upset. Of course, they worked through it. And to this day, they chide us for not watching quote unquote television, but there's a family value there, right? And so you just touched on a really interesting family value, right? Your wife was like, going to do kung fu minimum 1 year, period. Right? And there's a stick to itiveness
Yeah.
of your curiosity. So it's not like an ADHD thing. I'm going to try everything. No, it's I'm going to try it and be curious about it and be curious enough to invest some time to see if this is something I want and enjoy
Yeah.
in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you've touched on something with family values, or values just in general, and I think that's part of what makes a good unit, right? If you think about you and your wife and the things that are
Mm-hmm.
important, my wife and I have had very few conflicts in our marriage. And in fact, it's one of the challenges when you have a pretty harmonious marriage and relationship. How do you teach your children? I'd love your thoughts on this. How do you teach your children to have a conflict respectfully and effectively?
Hmm.
Right, right. Because a lot of
Yeah.
times you don't want to do it in front of your kids, right?
Right.
Because you're having the conflict, but at the same time you do. And yeah, I ask this question a lot to couples or anybody who's got kids. How do you teach your kids to be good at conflict?
It's a great question, David, and we talk about it a lot. My wife and I have very stark differences in terms of how we view world, how we maybe have a daily practice throughout the domestic home. And so we've had to actually talk through all of that. I'm a lot more extroverted. She's a lot more introverted. I'm really comfortable in lots of new situations. She has to ease into new situations. I have to help her ease into new situations instead of going out and just kind of doing what I might naturally do on my own. So we have to talk about that stuff. And so there were times when the girls got a little bit older where we just talked like adults as a relationship. And we would just say, hey, mom and dad are looking at this a little bit differently, but we're going to work this out. And so I think that the idea of having open dialogue in front of your kids so they can see how these relationships work in a real way and to learn how to talk about it. I'll give you a good example. I do I'm pretty handy in the house and I can do plumbing and stuff like that. And so we were going to embark on one of the major domestic improvements in the house, and that was replacing the stairwell case, right? So the stairwell is kind of the original thing. So, it's unbolting and literally taking out all of the handrail and all of the little, sidings things, taking everything out. And then I built and installed new ones, and they were wood and everything looked great. I took a week off of work. I mean, it was intense, right? All the tools, all the YouTube videos and stuff. And the girls were around when we were doing this, and I said, okay, hon, and we started to talk about, she said, well, what will I say that's really going to piss you off? And she was like, and there's certain things you're going to say and dismiss my concerns, which will piss me off. And so we had to talk about how we were going to talk about it, right? Talk about how to talk. And so to answer your question, I think that's the way to do it. I think that we always talked in front of our kids as if they were adults, even when they were little.
Yeah. I think that's a great strategy, and I don't know whether we have done that or not. We certainly do now. I don't know whether we did it when they were young. To what extent we did it when they were young.
Do your children get along?
They would say no. They would say no. They're not close. They're very different. One of them is part of the LGBTQ community. And I would say that we knew that probably when they were very young.
Okay.
And they came out to us. We waited, for them to come out to us. I think we were aware that was likely the case. And we talk a little bit about values and normalcy. They're two boys, 14 months apart, and the one in that camp would dress up in dresses and costumes and everything all the time. And it was so normal to do that the other boy, we have a picture with this huge smile on his face, is in this pink dress, right? He's not part of the LGBT community, but he was just like, this is fun. Like, my brother is doing this and I'm going to do it too. And that was normal. And so I guess I bring that up in part because while they're not close, I do think that they appreciate that they're different. And I'm hopeful because I wasn't particularly close with my brothers growing up, and now we're very close.
Sure.
So I still have, and my kids do see that because my brothers live in close proximity. my kids get to see how we interact and joke around um,
I think
uh,
that's critical. For them
yeah,
to have an uncle in their life that is a relationship that isn't dad, but an older
yeah,
man that's still
yeah,
family that loves them, but isn't you.
yep,
To see your dynamic as you get older and tell the stories. Well, we weren't as close when we were your age because kids, our daughters oscillated, right? There were times when they were in perfect harmony and they
yeah,
were best of friends. And then you hit these teenage years and they want separate rooms, and suddenly we're like, what do you mean you want separate rooms? You shared a room your entire life. How is this possible? And then they start getting different interests, and then there's a passage of time where it was a really challenged relationship between the two of them, and now they've kind of oscillated back closer, so their wavelengths are a little bit closer as they're getting older. And what I was telling our girls was that the siblings, it's an interesting thing, right? If you have siblings, it is the longest relationship of your life, hopefully,
it
right? And
is. Yeah,
they're the only, it's a 100-year relationship, right? They're the only ones who know you as child and mid passage, older adult, and older adult, right? Your parents really aren't as close to you as soon as you become an adult, right? Most of the vast majority of the time you spend with your child is when they're a child, not when they're an adult.
right.
So your children now might not get along, but I would think that the family values that you guys incorporated have a core so that they know it is the longest relationship of their lives.
I haven't thought of it that way, but that is a great way to think about it. And I talked recently, as as my father was in hospice, I talked to some of his friends, reaching out, and then had to notify them when he passed. And in many of those relationships, they have kids that are roughly our age. And I've
Mm-hmm.
talked with some of them, and in one of those cases, I talked with one of the son's brothers, who are maybe 2 years apart or thereabouts. And they said, he said, I hardly talk to him. We don't get along. And I just, there was this like feeling inside of me that was like so sad. And for that to be the case, because I do cherish what I have with my brothers, and I cherish that. I want that for my sons. Um,
Yeah, you do. I
yeah.
know. And my brother and I guess we were closer when we were younger, and then um, when we went off to our young adulthood, we physically went off to various places and completely different experiences. And he and I, he and I actually get along, I think, very well. We've had some challenges, though, as everybody does in a a 60-year relationship, right? Um, but there's no one on earth that I laugh with like I laugh with him. And I tell the girls that, right? The times that they are challenged with each other, I said, and because they're like, well, you're sometimes really, irritated with your brother. You guys sometimes don't get along. And I'm like, well, of course. When are you going to get along with someone all the time over 50 years? It's never going to happen, because you also have to carve out your own identity as a in the family unit, right? I am not my brother. I am myself. And what does that look like? And how do we separate out? Um, I think with your kids, as they are going through their transition, and was it a relief when they came out to you because you already knew that that was the path?
I don't, I don't, I don't know if I thought of it as a relief. I think I did feel happy for them that they could talk about it, and they came out to us, and it took a while before they came out to their friends,
Mm-hmm.
and they go by they them, so I'm going to use those
Yeah.
pronouns. And so they were outed by a school person at school,
Mm,
and that was terrible, because it wasn't that person's story to tell, and that's always just a really
right.
frustrating situation. And as a parent, you're like, and what do you do in that situation, right? Um, other than support the child, who I think was upset, but also was sort of like, well, I am. so
Right.
so
Right.
so
Right.
um, anyway, I don't know. I think for me, it started on a journey that is, even in today's day and age, a more challenging journey than a traditional or typical journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think of folks that we went to high school with. It wasn't common then, right? Nobody was out in my
No, in
class.
fact, in fact, as we were growing up, and I'm not going to say I'm embarrassed to say this, but because it wasn't something I really was aware of, I didn't meet anybody. Um, I should rephrase it. The very first openly gay person I met is when I went to college,
Hmm.
where it seemed to be a place where people could reinvent themselves outside of their growing up years. You know, however, it's roughly 10% of the 13% of the population. So of course we went to high school with, young men or women who now that we're older, we see either on Facebook or the like that, oh, okay, no problem, right? And
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that as we were growing up, it wasn't talked about. It's very much talked about in my children's generation,
Yes.
and especially in Southern California, in San Diego. So my girls went to a public high school that was an audition only performing arts school, kind of like the thing in New York, et cetera, but it's San Diego's creative and performing arts, where 2/3 of the population of the school were ladies. So about a third were men, and about half of the third of men were openly gay. So it was and there was not a single ethnic majority. So it's like this total multicultural thing where
Yeah.
everybody's talking about a new term that I didn't even know existed. They would come home and they would say, "Oh, I didn't know what the word cisgender meant, so I had to learn that. I didn't know what uh, it, it was it was." I even forget the phrases that are coming up, but it's I'm neutral, or I'm asexual, or I'm amorphous. I'm like I don't even know, and trying to keep up with the terms. I just learned that there's another thing, a 2A has been added too, where there's a more inclusiveness of people's ideas about identity. And so, now that it's more common to talk about it, are you guys having those conversations in the home?
Some. Our son doesn't always have a lot of patience for us. Gave us a book on pronouns
Okay.
because we grew up knowing our son as he him, right,
Yes.
and sort of on a dime for us, they wanted to be referred to as they them,
Sure.
and so that's you got to and to their credit, they were like, okay, I acknowledge this may not be you know this may not be obvious for you, so I'm going to give you this book. So I think part of that is their approach, a little reluctant for conflict,
Hmm.
which is maybe why I asked that question too earlier.
Yeah.
How do you teach your children how to have constructive conflict? Because I always see it as if you can get to a commonality and then work through it, you end up in a better place afterwards. So the commonality is, hey, I love you. I'm always going to love you. I want what's
Sure.
best for you, right? And
Yeah.
so if you remind yourself on that, everything else, the conflict's down here somewhere. We can work that out. And I may view it differently. I may approach. Tell me what I'm missing. These are the facts as I know them. This is all through sort of some learnings that I've done over the years. But I wish that they were more comfortable with conflict so that they could say, oh, I don't like it when you do this, or it makes me feel this way. And those are things
Yeah.
that I want them to be able to work through, not just with us, but with any relationship.
Yeah, and that's a great skill to have. It's a hard skill to learn when you're a teenager and still in high school. It gets a lot
Yeah.
easier as you get older, and you're in greater practice and of other people having those conversations. And I think that it must be a very interesting. Well, it's just more to learn, right, for you and your wife. It's more to learn about how to have those conversations that are respectful and feel better to them, and that they feel like you're really listening to them.
It absolutely is. And so I did talk to my wife and my son before I signed us up for this, but we are actually presenting on intergenerational communication skills
Huh.
at Cultivating Change, which is the LGBTQ community for agriculture in about a month, a little less than a couple of weeks now.
Oh
And
wow.
and we're still working on the presentation and whatnot. But the way that that our son thinks about things and refers to things, that's just natural to them, right?
Yeah.
That's just the way it is. But for us, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? And for my father, who was super
Right.
accepting, both of my parents were super accepting of our
Excellent.
son. And again, a privilege. It's not always the case, but was also learning. And of course, my dad and
Mm-hmm.
my mom, when she was still alive, were asked questions and were genuinely interested. And
That's
I think,
great.
so we'll bring some of that in because that was kind of funny. My father and mother took our kids. This is again a privilege. Took our kids. We didn't have this growing up, but I think it's a fantastic gift for grandchildren and for the grandparents. They would take them
Mm-hmm.
on these week-long trips, right?
Oh,
Just the
that's
grandparents,
awesome.
right? And it was just one of the grandkids generally at a time. So I mean, think about how special that is as a grandchild,
Mm-hmm.
to have that one-on-one time with grandparents and be spoiled. But they would go on learning trips. So one time they went to the circus, and one time they went to Harry Potter something, whatever. It was stuff that the kids could choose a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go on a trapeze when I was 8 years old. Darn it!
I had a beautiful 2 weeks with my grandma on my dad's side. It was a fluke. It was I was in high school. It was that summer, and I'm like most kids doing jack nothing. And my grandma said, "Hey, my grandfather, time Bunky, said can't make it. Right, can't make the trip. He's not well enough. Do you want to go?" And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And everyone's like, "Oh, you're so nice to go with your grandma." I'm like, "Are you kidding me? This is incredible." I remember that so fondly. I have such a deep appreciation for that time. And I think it's wonderful that your folks got to have that time with their grandchildren. Um, you know, and as your mom started to get older and your dad passed in hospice, um, how did you think about that relationship between them and your own children and the memories that your kids have of their grandparents?
Um, well, they'll be forever in the sense that my dad was a photographer. That was one of his hobbies, even when I was growing up. So there are tons of photographs, but I also think there are lots of stories.
Hmm,
And a lot of those came out for my dad at his celebration of life, and for my
that's
mom
great.
at hers. The kids do appreciate that. And part of what my parents really wanted was for us to continue to get together. They had this thing. They're like, okay, when we're both passed away, they decided to be cremated. We want our ashes to be commingled, and then we want you to have to every 4 months transfer the urn to the other kid. So I would give it to my older brother, and so because they wanted to make sure that we were seeing each other, right?
That is awesome. What a
So
brilliant tactic. You will see
yeah,
your sibling every 4 months by carrying my urn to them.
yeah. So my dad actually wanted to write that into the will, and the lawyer was like, "Yeah, you can write it, but it's not." And now that they're both local, we do it anyway.
Sure.
But I would say that my dad would be super pleased. My parents would both be super pleased that we've carried on this tradition of getting together. We're getting
Mm-hmm.
together over Thanksgiving, and one of my brothers has to work, so he can't make it. But my other brother, we're going away somewhere, and we're actually bringing with us some other I'd consider adopted brothers and sisters with us in that
Great.
family tradition. People who actually traveled with my parents and did these
Oh,
trips, right? And so. Um, it's going to be a new memory without them, but in their honor, right? So
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
and the kids, there's some kid overlap there. The kids will continue that hopefully forward as they get older, but certainly as long as we're doing it, they're gonna see those fellow teenagers and
That's
20 somethings
awesome.
when they get older. Yeah, yeah.
That's wonderful.
You
I'm
have
going
a
to
very
wait.
vocal. I was gonna say you have a very vocal
You can
person.
hear that cat. Wait 1 second. I got to open this door up.
I've seen it's a girl cat. or female
No,
cat?
this is Mr. Peanut. This is the
Oh,
orange
Mr.
tabby.
Peanut. Got it. Okay.
Mr. P doesn't like it when the doors close, especially because my daughter's out for a walk. So I think the fact that your folks had a tradition of travel, pouring that tradition of travel onto you guys, and now you're going to be traveling too, kind of in their honor. You said your youngest son that they went off to Germany, came back and travel. Um, as you start thinking about this next stage of your life, how important is travel going to be for you and your family? And it seems like that's a family value because the travel creates so much more. I don't know. I have to believe it generates some wisdom. I have to believe that it generates some appreciation for how other people live.
It does. It's not quite as immersive as the experiences we talked about earlier, but on my wall here, again, I have everything up close. These are you can't see it. Can't see it.
That's all right.
All right. So these are one of my sons, and actually both sons have prioritized these different places, and we're going to talk about the commonality of places that they want to go. And then we're going to cross check that with my brother's kids and with my brothers and sort of say, okay, now we didn't go to any of these. These are all more or less international, not all of them, but many of them. And I'm not going to go in order, but some of them are like the kids. And look, I'm at a stage where I'm going to bribe my kids so that I can spend time with them. I'm not
Exactly.
ashamed to say that, right? And if that means they get to bring friends, so be it. I'm going to spend as much time with them as I can. So Hawaii's on there. Brazil, which I found interesting. Paris was on there, which I found interesting. I actually spent 2 weeks with my son who had been in Germany. I'd spent 2 weeks with him in Paris. So this was my other son, but my son that I spent time said, yeah, I'd go back there. The Caribbean, Cuba, which I've never been to.
Interesting.
Costa Rica. There's a trend of warm, right?
Right. I can see that.
I'm curious if that's part of it. But this is actually that list was generated from the son who is a little less inclined to travel. So I want to I'm going to take this list and be like, oh, well, you said you wanted to go to Cuba. Let's do it.
Right.
Let's plan it and go to Cuba and see how many of these family members we can get to go with us.
I love that. And, I think that, this is a theme then that's been happening in this conversation where you really think of unit, you really think of family, you really think of people doing this together and kind of creating that safe haven that binds us together in these deep family relationships. I love that. I think a lot of, my family in particular, geographically is split up. Right. So my brother's in Philadelphia. My mom is in Virginia. My dad is still in Pittsburgh. I have cousins everywhere. But what's happening now, what we're trying to do is to create a new generation of proximity. So my eldest daughter and her husband moved back to San Diego about a month plus ago. So they're about 10 minutes away. I'm going to see her for coffee tomorrow, just casually, which is great. My youngest daughter is living with us. She's lives in San Diego, was living with roommates and stuff, and she wanted to save some money and she didn't want to go back to the beach. And so she said, oh, can I live at home? And I'm like, absolutely, right? Because for most of your life, you won't be living at home. So yeah, I'm gonna take that opportunity. And I wonder, what I wonder also is if that was influenced by COVID, because we're in this stage where our kids had to be at home. So both of my kids had to be at home in COVID as kind of youngish, adultish kids. And then I remember this clearly. I'm sure a lot of people do. This is maybe May, right after the novelty is worn off, right? Everyone's like, oh, we're all home. This is kind of fun. We'll do cocktails, I guess, in the driveway with friends, and we're all staying games. We're making yet another loaf of bread, and right, we're all home. But in May, they started to get that itch. And I said, you guys, we have to figure out how to make the best of this. You cannot go out to see your friends. We have to figure this out as family, right? There's no other way. We can either be miserable together or we can figure it out together. So in some ways for us, because we were fortunate enough not to have anyone close get ill or perish. But it created this, I don't know, a concentration of time where we all worked together and had to live together as we were older. Did you? How was your COVID experience? Because your kids were probably in high school-ish when it happened.
They were in middle school.
Middle school.
Yeah, the older, and I do want to touch. We didn't lose anybody in super close proximity, but my best friend did lose his mom
Oh.
during that time, and it was tragic. She had been in a home, got COVID, and she passed in the hospital by herself, and I just there are so many stories like that. I feel for him, for their family, and for anybody who's gone through that. Uh, yeah, my father, we did see him during that time. It was, my mom had passed already. It was important for us to see my dad. We took tests before we went and visited. We masked up. We did what we needed to do. And we did pod up. We found a family of three, a mother, a husband, and a daughter who got along with both of our boys. And we made a rule that, other than my dad, who they knew I was going to go see, and the boys would go see, and our family, we would all go see my dad from time to time. But he didn't have many visitors, right? It was essentially us and my brother. My other brother hadn't moved out there yet. So my brother who lived in Napa, that was about it, right? He was very isolated, and so that was challenging for him. But we would go up and we'd have game night with him, and but we potted with his family, and I would say we cooked because we had these rules, which we abided by. We were able to cook together 3 times a week or more.
Great, right?
We played poker. I mean, my younger son is quite a poker player.
That's awesome.
Learned in middle school, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't know whether he still got the chops, but he knew 10 different ways to play poker when he was in 7th grade.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too. You wonder about the memories that passes on, right? When people say what they go through, and I think that creating that again. There you go. You create this unit, even if it's with another family, it's still a unit. And there's, I think, a comfort and a strength, and I don't know, call it a foundation, but there's something strong there when people know that they're a part of a close, loving group.
Absolutely. And I would say that I want to, and Jessica's in the same boat. We want to expose our children to these powerful units. We don't have we've got some friends but not all of them have kids, right? And so in the LGBT community that are couples in the LGBT community, but they have friends, so kids. So a challenge is my kids only want to hang out with adults for a certain amount of time.
Right.
So the benefit of having strong relationships with other couples that have kids is that they can hang out with us for a while and then they go off and do their own thing.
That's right.
And at the same time, I'd love to I don't know, introduce strong relationships of all types to my kids. We haven't found that relationship yet. We do have one set of friends. We're going to go see them actually this coming weekend, I think, where they're not, but their child is in that LGBTQ community, right? So
yeah.
So that's not quite the same as where I'd like to be, but as you've probably discovered, you tend to you've got your friends who have no relationship to your kids, but as your kids grow, you do kind of migrate to the people who your kids like and you like their parents.
Yeah, I think that is rare. We talked about that too. That is a rare combination to find parents that you get along with and a good friend of your child that everybody seems to get along. That is 1 out of 20, right? It's like this. It's like a magic moment. Wait 1 second.
It is absolutely a magic moment. Yeah.
Thanks. So, one of the things that I guess I would ask you is, I'm sure when you were with your dad during hospice and, as he was thinking and you were thinking about his passage and thinking about how he has lived his life, and you're now, at a stage where you're looking at this next stage of life, right? There are certain stages that happen to where you've got, a child who's graduating high school. That's a big transition for everybody. Someone who's coming up and that's going to move on as well. You're now, as parent, you move into a different stage too. What are you thinking about those stages for yourself right now?
I think that over the past several years, I've regained focus on self-care. I think there was a period of maybe 10 years where whether it was the combination of emphasis on the family, emphasis on the job. I didn't take as good a care of myself, nutrition, athletics and whatnot. And so I feel that for me, sort of this next stage, I'll make sure, I want to make sure that that's continued, because we're also at an age where, they tell you got to be lifting weights and doing this and that, and you got to stay, eat better. And so, I do want to be around. I hope my kids have kids. Our older one is actually, both of them don't even talk about it, but I hope they do, because I think that's a joy to be a grandparent, and another privilege, something that I would love to experience, and I want to be there for that. Right.
Yeah.
You talked about travel, and I'm not sure I closed the loop on that, but I would like to, not just because my parents did it, but there are all these places that I'd like to go and explore and understand better. I'd love to be in a place financially where I could say, oh, we're going to go for 3 or 4 or 5 months, right? We're going to go for a while. We're going to sit down and do this. I'm not sure that's where my wife is. But if I can convince her that if I can get that good first experience, I may be on a trajectory that make that happen. Otherwise, we'll go and do some things for a couple, 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah. No, I love that. Are there certain areas of the world of different academic or idea pursuits that you want to think about and focus on? Are there certain things that have intrigued you that you really want to know more about?
Oh, that's tricky. It's honing it down. There are a lot of things that I would like to know more about, right? And even all these books on, like, he did a lot of history, a lot of music. My dad, right? I'm pointing to him because you know what I'm pointing to. But for the audience,
I think that's beautiful that your dad has volumes of books on tape and that he gave to you so that you could listen to the things he was interested in.
Yeah. And I didn't take all of them, because there were some things I was like, I'm never going to listen to this, right? It just, but I took a lot of them, and I do like history. I've always liked history. My poor kids, when we went to Europe, my one son was already in Germany, and we all went over the winter holiday, and neither of them, but especially the one who didn't live there, just isn't interested in art, isn't interested in history. And what do you do when you go to Europe? You go to museums, right?
Right, exactly. You go to art, you go to history. That's why you go.
It's like the worst vacation ever for us.
That's hilarious.
But I could sink into that. But actually, what I really love to do is sit down and have a conversation with somebody who lives there, right? And I love to do it. I love to do it in their language. I can do that in German. I can probably do it in French. It would be rough, but I could probably do it. I can't yet do it in Spanish. And this is why maybe I still migrate towards Europe, because the idea of learning an Asian language, Thai or
it's a heavy lift.
It's a heavy lift. It's a super heavy lift, like Japanese. I don't see myself doing it. I don't see myself doing it.
That's a heavy lift, because what's interesting though, that even know more about you now, because going to those places, you're looking for a deeper connection. You're looking for a more human connection, something that transcends just, oh, this is a great meal, but what is the culture and how do you think differently than I think?
Actually, so I'll tell you a little quick story here. When I went to Germany the first time and lived there, not no, it's actually the second time. First time I went was in college. Second time I went back on a Fulbright and taught English at a junior college. Essentially, these were people who had already had a profession and went back and were trying to get to university. And the German system says you got to go to junior college first. And so I befriended somebody there who's actually older than me, a couple of years, and we have remained friends. And this is one of the people who actually traveled with my parents more than they've traveled with me.
Wow.
Right. And so, he and his partner, and they can't both come to this trip that we've got coming up, but he's coming.
Oh,
He's
that's
coming for the
cool.
week, right? Uh, and so because he knows the importance of the Nothman extended unit,
Uh-huh.
and the fun that can be had. Like he really enjoys my brothers, he enjoys my
Uh-huh.
kids, and I say he, but they, because partner Silka is the same way. Um, but that connection, he's super inquisitive. He asks all sorts of questions and um, is a really deep thinker. And I'd love to have that connection with somebody. I have a little bit of that with somebody from Belgium who I roomed with when I lived
Mm-hmm.
there. And we got to see her on that trip over the holidays. So those connections, I think, are made when you live somewhere and you share an experience with somebody for a while, for a period of time. Um, and uh, and so that's what I'm looking for those extended stays. When you say what's the future, the next few months,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not financially in a place. I don't think that I can retire. Um,
Right.
I am. I still feel like there's something I can give to the food and ag community. So I want to do that if I find the right company and role to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in the what's the future hold? I'd like to spend time in other countries and other locations, getting to know people and their views of the world.
I love that, David. I think that's such a beautiful goal, because, in knowing other people, you get to understand them, you get to appreciate them and appreciate how they view the world. And there's no doubt that people from different countries view the world differently. And, I would argue that in a way, that mission is for you extending that unit that you've created, this unit of love and connected people, but extending that to other places and having them fold into the Nothman unit.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. We actually have on WhatsApp, we have a channel with more than just my brothers and their families. It's got this extended, it's called the Extended Nothman, not unit, but Extended Nothman family or something, right? And
Yeah,
so,
the extended
yeah,
family.
yeah. The
That's
family you
marvelous.
choose. Yeah,
It's the family you choose. That's the family you have, and the family you choose creates the family you live with and grow with.
well, and I will say, going through the process of settling my father's estate, uh, my and speaking with the lawyer, she's like, "Oh well, there's always some tension with some family member, yada yada." And my brothers and I were like, "Yep, not going to happen." And there
Yeah,
was never an issue, right? We were
that's
just like,
wonderful. That's
and
that's a blessing. And you know what, too? That is a testament to your parents,
it is,
that they raised you to be at a place where there isn't tension. Well, that is such a beautiful legacy that they left with you. It's interesting. I was talking to my friend, Tim, and there's a concept of generational wealth, which I get, right? Those who are the most privileged have financial generational wealth, right? But there's generational wealth that happens with a value, a spirit, a way to view the world. And the fact that your parents left you and your siblings with this generational wealth of love and understanding, and a way in which you build family units and build connections in a family and build a family, that's the best legacy ever.
I agree, and I think my parents would be, be honored, proud. I don't know what the right word is, but I think they just wanted that love between us as brothers, and it extended to other people. I think they would be very, very pleased that that's how it ended up. And it's not just me saying that. If you talk to my brothers, you know them. I know you're not in touch with them, but
Yeah,
if you were to talk with them, they'd say the same thing.
that's marvelous. And I wish you, and I think that will probably carry on to your kids as well.
I hope so. That's what we want.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, David, this has been just a marvelous conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
I'm tickled to have done so. I think what you're doing is really valuable for a whole host of people, but especially I think for men who are going through trying to figure out, how do I do better? What can I do? What can I learn from other men? I've learned so much through your guests already, and I look forward to listening to future sessions and speaking the gospel, so to speak, of what you've got to share. And I really applaud you for doing it. I know you've got a full-time job and you got family, and this is something in addition that you're putting on your plate. But I just want to say, to me, it's added a lot of value, and I look forward to future sessions that you post.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And maybe what we'll do is we'll have another session where you and I can talk about some other things that you want to talk about.
That would be great. Now, I don't know if it's coming up, and I don't mean to preempt you, but I do know you have this thing that you ask of a lot of people, and I'm prepared.
Bring it. Who do you know that I don't know that I should know?
All right. So I've been thinking about this, and I wasn't entirely sure where we would go, but I had a perspective. So I'm going to give you, actually, it's a bit of a laundry list, but they're units.
Wonderful.
They're units of people. So my friends Kim and Seth, who we're going on this trip with, Andreas and Silka. Andreas is coming, but Silka is not going to be able to be there. Missy and Patrick, they're coming to this thing that we're going to get together. And then one of my brothers, Andrew, and his wife, Beth. Those are
wonderful
units of people who I'd love for you to get to know, so that you can understand the extended Nothman culture.
Family, the extended Nothman family. Well, that is beautiful. And if we get the chance to do that, and if I'm truly blessed and honored to be a part of the extended Nothman family, I'd happily join that family. That is great. So maybe we can plan a time where my wife and I head up, you guys come down. We'd love to see you.
Yep, we'd love to host you. But yeah, we'd love to get to know you and your wife better. So that sounds great.
David, you're fantastic. My blessings to you and your family. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you.
Well, my man, David Nothman. What a remarkable way of viewing the world and kind of passing on the acknowledged privileges of his life and moving that down to the next generation. I really loved that story of his parents, with the urn, to have their kids share the urn, right? I think that that's a beautiful thing to do, to make sure everybody gets together. And as he starts thinking about his kids, what kind of legacy he's leaving. This is one of those families that has generational wealth in a material way, but has generational wealth in terms of their habits and beliefs and how they view a family life, right? He's really pulled that family unit together and is pulling people into this family unit. So not only is it expanding, but it's getting tighter and stronger. So what did I learn from David? I learned that you can create this strong family unit and pull other people into it, and to create a sense of what family can be and should be, and what families do for each other in the healthiest way, right? We hear a lot of stories about unhealthy families, but his is a story of a healthy family. And of course, people rub their fur the wrong way. We get it sometimes, but generally, he's got a happy family. So I learned from him is that value of keeping that family together and then building more people into that family so it becomes an extended family of strength and support for everybody. And what does that do for you as a kid? Man, it gives you support. It gives you a safety net. And what does it do for you as a man? It also gives you a safety net. You don't have to be young to jump into the net and be caught. Everybody can be saved. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'd love to have a yik yak with you. Visit menfolkjourneys.com and you can book a conversation with me. I'll make it easy and memorable and enjoyable. Thanks for listening. Word bid Philarid.